Hi.
The bride was left standing alone until a child whispered, "Please, be my new mama." The wind caught the hem of Clara Wells' skirt as she stepped down from the train at Sand Hill Station, Kansas, the wooden platform creaking beneath her modest boots. Autumn clung to the air, sharp, rust-scented, filled with dry leaves tumbling like lost promises. She clutched a worn suitcase to her chest, eyes searching the crowd for a familiar face, for a tall man in a work shirt and suspenders who would smile and say her name. But no one stood waiting. Townsfolk bustled past her without pause, some glancing, most not. Two women near the telegraph office whispered, "Another mail-order bride, poor thing." Clara tried to stand tall, her back straight as the cross-stitch seams of her blouse, but her hands trembled against the handle of her case. A station hand tipped his hat, eyes filled with awkward sympathy, and moved on. She waited. 5 minutes, 10, then longer still. The train gave a final puff and rolled away, leaving only dust and disappointment in its wake. Her fiancé, Abel Carter, had promised to meet her. There had been letters. Short, plain, but sincere, or so she believed. And now, nothing. No note, no greeting. Just silence. The platform emptied until only Clara remained, framed by the station's wooden awning and the long shadow of the telegraph pole. She crossed to a bench and sat, hands folded tightly in her lap, the suitcase beside her like a companion too polite to speak. Around her, the town unfolded without ceremony, children laughing somewhere unseen, horses' hooves clopping on packed dirt, the distant clang of a hammer striking metal. The world kept turning, as if she hadn't arrived at all. She turned her face to the wind and blinked against the sting in her eyes. She had come so far, miles across states, hours alone in train cars that smelled of coal and old sweat, all to be met by nothing but silence. The letter in her pocket, folded and reread until the creases split, now felt like a cruel joke. Her gloved hands fumbled with it again, as if it might say something new. But the words hadn't changed. "Clara Wells, you will be welcome here." She was not welcome. She was not even noticed. Around her, strangers began to pass with quicker steps, throwing occasional glances of pity or curiosity. A boy tossed a stone near her feet and was pulled away by his mother. Someone laughed, not at her, but still, the sound struck like insult. Clara drew her coat tighter, feeling the first true cold settle into her bones. Her hope, so carefully packed with her dresses and combs, began to unravel thread by thread. She was not a wife here, not even a guest, just a woman without a home in a town that didn't want her. On the second morning, as frost clung thinly to the iron bench where Clara still sat with her suitcase tucked beneath her feet, a small figure emerged from the mist rising off the prairie. He wore boots too large for his feet and a coat missing 2 buttons, and he moved with the quiet awkwardness of someone in use of being noticed. Clara saw him out of the corner of her eye and turned slowly, her breath a visible ribbon in the cold. The boy stood just beyond the awning's shadow, his brown hair mussed and wind-blown, one hand clenched at his side, the other holding something wrapped in cloth. He looked no older than 7. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, eyes wide and earnest, he walked forward and gently took Clara's hand in his small one. "Please," he whispered, voice thin as paper. "Please be my new mama." The word struck Clara like a bell tolling in a still church. She blinked, unsure she had heard correctly. "What did you say?" she asked softly. The boy's eyes glistened, and he swallowed before speaking again. "I wrote the letter," he said. "It wasn't Papa. He didn't know. I just wanted someone like you. Someone who'd come." His voice faltered. Clara stared at him, at the red in his cheeks and the dirt under his nails, and for a moment she forgot her own shame and confusion. "What's your name?" she asked. "Tommy," he said quickly. "My name's Tommy. I saw your picture at the post office, on the board with the other brides, and I liked your eyes. You look kind." Clara didn't know what to say. She felt hollowed out by travel and rejection, and yet here was this boy, clutching her hand like a lifeline. Tommy turned, still holding tight, and said, "I can take you home now. I have to show you to Papa. He didn't ask for a wife, but I think he needs one even if he don't know it." He began to lead her, his grip surprisingly strong. Clara glanced back once toward the bench, the station, the tracks that had brought her here. Then she looked forward again, and let him guide her away from all of it. The path led to the edge of town where the buildings leaned from years of wind and weather, past the blacksmith shed and the half-built chapel with its bell still sitting unstrung in the grass, until it opened onto a dusty track lined with cottonwoods whose leaves clattered like bones in the breeze. Tommy walked ahead of her, still holding her hand, though he said little now, and Clara could feel the tension in his arm, as if he were bracing for something, or someone when they reached the last house on the far edge of Sand Hills. She saw a fence that sagged with age and a yard scattered with scraps of wood, a wheelbarrow overturned and half buried in yellowing weeds. And then the door opened, and a man stepped out onto the porch, tall and angular, with shoulders like beams and eyes that took her in all at once. He wore a canvas shirt stained with sawdust, and his face was unshaven, his mouth a hard line as he looked first at her, then at Tommy. "What's this?" he asked, and his voice was not cruel, but not kind either, just worn down like everything else in this place. And Tommy dropped Clara's hand and stood straight as he could, chin lifted in defiance. "She's here. Pa. Just like I wrote, she came." And the man's brow furrowed, and he looked at Clara again, slower this time, as if trying to read a language he didn't speak. "You wrote?" he asked Tommy, and the boy nodded, swallowing hard. "I didn't tell you because I thought if I did, you'd say no, and then to—" "Clara," the man said, "you'd best come inside before folks see you standing out here." And though it was an invitation in tone, it was still a door, and Clara stepped through it, feeling again the strange pull of something she couldn't name. Inside, the house smelled of old wood and dust, the floorboards creaked with each step, and the walls were bare except for a single clock that had stopped at a time no one seemed to remember. There was no sign of another woman's touch, no curtain on the window, no vase, not even a chair pulled out from the table. Abel Carter. She learned his name only later that evening. Moved like a man who had learned to live with absence and didn't expect it to change. His words few, his eyes always watching, measuring. "You can sleep on the cot in Tommy's room," he said, "just for the night, until we figure this out." Clara nodded, though part of her bristled at being dismissed before the sun had even set, and yet something in the way Tommy leaned against her made it impossible to walk away. Not yet, not until she understood what kind of silence filled this place, and why a boy would go to such desperate lengths to bring a stranger to his door. That night, she unpacked only her nightdress and her comb, laying them carefully on the wooden chest at the foot of the narrow bed beside Tommy's. And as she brushed her hair by lamplight, she heard the boy whisper across the dark, "He won't say it, but he's glad you're here." And Clara, staring at her own reflection in the warped glass of the mirror, wondered what it would take for a man like Abel Carter to speak what he felt, or even to feel at all. Outside, wind stirred the trees, and the house groaned as if remembering things it no longer wanted to carry, and Clara lay down without undressing further, unsure if she was a guest or a ghost in someone else's life, before sleep took her. She thought of the station bench, of how no one had come, and how this boy, this strange and stubborn child, had somehow turned her rejection into a summons, and that was how she arrived, not as a bride, not as a wife, but as a quiet answer to a question no one else had dared to ask aloud. The morning came with no warmth, only gray light seeping through the uncurtained window as Clara sat up slowly, the unfamiliar room wrapping around her like a coat not yet broken in. Tommy was still asleep, one hand curled around a wooden horse with a broken leg, his breath soft and steady in the stillness. Clara rose and dressed quietly, her fingers numb with cold, and stepped into the hallway where the smell of stale wood and damp lingered heavy in the air. In the kitchen, she found a table littered with nails, shavings of pine, and a hammer half buried beneath scraps of leather. On the stove sat a kettle untouched, and beside it, a pan with dust gathered in its curve. She opened the back door to let in fresh air and began to work without a word, wiping down the surfaces, clearing the tools from the table, sweeping the floor, and setting the kettle to boil. Abel appeared in the doorway, surprised but saying nothing, his arms crossed and face unreadable as she moved around his space like someone rearranging a life. She found flour in a tin and baked a rough bread, cut apples into a pan with a little water, and set them on the stove until their scent pushed the silence back a few inches. Tommy stumbled in, eyes wide with sleep and wonder, and whispered, "It smells like my birthday." Abel didn't sit, didn't touch the food, only watched with a guarded sort of stillness, like a man trying to decide whether kindness was a threat. Clara served them both, taking only a little for herself, and when she offered Abel a plate, he took it without meeting her gaze. No one thanked her, but that didn't matter. She worked through the day, scrubbing the sink, brushing the dust from windowsills, folding the one towel she could find, and by evening, the house had begun to change, not fully, not loudly, but in a way that could be felt like a draft sealed off or a door finally oiled on its hinges. When night came again, Abel lit the lamp himself. Clara found the letter hidden behind a stack of scrap in the corner of the living room, tucked between two lengths of cedar that had been meant for a cradle never finished. It was folded neatly, the edges worn from small hands, and when she opened it, the handwriting struck her. It was not a man's hand, but a child's, large and looping, full of hope and misspellings, the ink smudged in places where, perhaps, a tear had fallen, or a hand had trembled. Dear Miss Clara, it read, My name is Tommy Carter. I am 7. My mama died when I was 4, and my papa don't smile anymore. He works all day and don't talk much. I miss songs and hugs and bread with honey. If you come, maybe he'll talk again. Maybe I can have a mama again. I picked your picture because your eyes look like morning. Please come. I will be waiting. Love, Tommy. Clara sat on the edge of the cot, the letter open in her lap, and felt her chest grow tight with something she hadn't let herself feel since stepping off the train. Purpose, and something close to grief, because in this letter was a world too big for one boy to carry alone. When she brought it to Abel that evening, she said nothing, only placed it on the table between them where his hands were working a piece of oak into a chair leg. He stared at it, without touching it. I didn't know, he said after a long while, his voice low, thick. He never told me. Clara waited. She saw the conflict in his eyes, the flicker of shame that crossed his face before he looked away. After her, he began, then stopped, the name unspoken but present like a breath held too long. I didn't think I had anything left to give. I figured working and keeping him fed was enough. Talking, singing, those were luxuries. I didn't know he missed them so much. Clara didn't speak, because it didn't feel like he was talking to her exactly, but some shadow of himself. He's a good boy, Abel said. Too good for the man I've been. He rubbed his hands together, thick with calluses, and for a moment he looked not hard but lost. Clara placed the letter gently back on the table. He's also a boy who believes in more than he's been given, she said quietly. And that's not just goodness. That's faith. Abel's eyes met hers for the first time without resistance, and in them she saw something shift. Not surrender, not yet, but the first fracture in the wall he had built around his life. That night, he didn't retreat to his workbench after dinner. He sat by the stove, and when Tommy asked for a song, Clara began to sing, soft and low, and though Abel didn't join in, he listened. It began with a shatter, the sharp crack of glass meeting the floor and the sudden flare of orange against the night. Clara was in the kitchen, rinsing the last plate from supper, Tommy humming quietly as he stacked spoons beside her, when the smell hit first. Smoke, thick and fast, and before she could turn, the boy was already running toward the back door shouting, "The barn!" And Abel's boots thundered across the floor from the front porch where he'd been sitting alone again, eyes fixed on. Nothing, heart heavy with everything he hadn't yet said. By the time Clara reached the yard, the sky above the barn had turned the color of panic, flames licking at the rafters like hungry tongues, the straw catching fast, sending embers into the wind. And for a moment, everything stilled. Then Abel shouted for Tommy, told him to stay by the well, and Clara, without thinking, grabbed the water pail, already half full, and dashed toward the flames alongside the man who still hadn't decided whether she was meant to stay. The heat slapped her like a punishment, the air thick with burning hay and the bitter reek of old oil, and they worked without words, Abel hauling water from the trough and Clara running back and forth, skirt soaked, arms shaking, the fire roaring louder than fear, louder than her breath. They moved like gears in the same machine, Abel tossing buckets into flame, while Clara beat at the spreading sparks with a wet burlap sack. The barns were groaning under the strain, threatening to collapse. Once, Abel caught her wrist and pulled her back just as a beam gave way, crashing where she'd been standing not seconds before, and in that moment she saw something in his eyes, Fear, not for himself, but for her. And though he didn't speak it, it settled between them like an unspoken vow. Together they fought it, hour folding into hour, until finally the fire surrendered its hunger, leaving behind only smoke and ruin. The barn blackened but not gone. The roof, half caved, tools scorched, the air pulsing with the ache of what could have been worse. Clara collapsed to her knees near the pump, coughing, hair matted with sweat and ash, and Abel stood above her, chest heaving, shirt torn and damp, the light from the house painting him in gold and shadow. Tommy ran to her then, throwing his arms around her neck, whispering, "You didn't run," over and over, and she held him close, her body trembling not from exhaustion, but from something deeper, something. Like belonging, Abel knelt beside them, one hand resting on Tommy's back, the other reaching out slowly, hesitantly, to Clara's shoulder, and though he didn't speak, the gesture was its own language, his silence now filled not with absence, but with meaning. Later, when the fire was only memory and the three of them sat by the cold well drinking water from the same cup, Abel finally said, "You're not made of glass," and Clara, wiping soot from her cheek, replied, "Neither are you," and though nothing more passed between them, it was enough. For that night, for the new shape their lives had begun to take, formed not from promises or papers, but from the way they stood shoulder to shoulder when the world turned cruel. The letter came in a stiff white envelope, its seal already cracked by the postmaster, who had walked out himself instead of letting it sit in the box like the others, his boots stirring dust along the road as he approached the house with the grim expression of someone delivering more than words. Clara was at the clothesline, pinning Tommy's shirt to the rope when she saw him speak briefly to Abel, then hand over the envelope and tip his hat before walking back the way he came without, waiting for a thank you. Abel stood there holding the letter, like it might burn him, and he opened it. And when Clara approached, he didn't speak, just extended it toward her, his face stone-set, and she took it gently, smoothing the creases with careful fingers as she unfolded the paper and began to read. The words were clipped and formal, steeped in legal weight and cold intent. Miss Eunice Brewer, sister to the late Margaret Carter, had arrived in Sand Hills and filed a petition with the county court seeking full custody of Thomas Carter, citing the father's unsuitable emotional state and the questionable circumstances surrounding the presence of one Clara Wells, an unmarried woman residing in the home. Clara read the letter twice, her throat tightening as the phrases blurred together. Evaluate the household, ensure the child's best interests, temporary placement pending final hearing. And when she looked up at Abel, his jaw was clenched, his eyes fixed on the horizon like he'd known this was coming since the moment Clara stepped off that train. "She means to take him," he said flatly, the words neither loud nor angry, but full of something heavier, like regret shaped into iron. And Clara folded the letter slowly and tucked it back into its envelope as if that might quiet the storm it carried. Inside, Tommy sat at the kitchen table drawing horses on a scrap of paper, unaware that someone he barely remembered had come to unmake his world, and that night, when the dishes were done and the lamps burned low, he leaned against Clara and asked, "Why would Aunt Eunice want me now?" And Abel, who had spent the evening sanding a chair down to the grain in silence, finally looked up and said carefully, "Because she thinks it's her duty now that your mama's gone, and maybe she believes it's love, but she don't know what you've had to live without these years, and she don't know who you are anymore." Tommy was quiet for a long time, then said, "I don't want to go," and Clara pulled him gently into her arms, her hand resting at the back of his head as he leaned into her shoulder, and Abel stood and crossed the door, staring out into the dark, and though he said nothing else, the way he held himself said what he could not. He would not let this happen without a fight, not again, not this time. But outside, beyond the light of their porch, the wind had shifted, and the town was already whispering, already watching, and some battles came not with guns but with signatures and silence. And the hardest part was knowing that kindness alone might not be enough. The days that followed moved like slow water, heavy and deliberate, the kind that carved stone not with force but with persistence. And in that stillness, Clara and Abel began to find a rhythm, not spoken aloud or planned, but one that formed in the spaces between what had been said and what remained unsaid. Eunice Brewer had not returned yet, though the letter hung in their minds like smoke from a long fire, always there, always bitter, but in its waiting shadow the house continued to breathe, and in that breathing something new began to take shape, something fragile and unfamiliar. Clara rose early now, often before the sun, and would find Abel already in the yard, splitting wood or working the fence, his movements quiet but sure, and where once he might have nodded and gone back to his task, now he waited just long enough for her to step beside him, and sometimes he passed her the extra tool, without a word, and they worked shoulder to shoulder in silence that felt less like distance and more like agreement. She patched the fence while he hammered the crossboards. She dug up the hard soil while he brought water from the well. And in the evenings he set a bucket near the stove without asking, and she washed the boys' clothes without complaint. There were no declarations, no soft confessions, but slowly the house began to change, not with paint or new walls, but with hands reaching for the same burden and lifting it together. Tommy watched them both with the cautious hope of a child who had learned too early that promises can vanish, but each day that passed without Clara leaving made his steps lighter, his laughter louder. And one afternoon he brought her a wildflower, ragged but proud, and said, "You can have this for your hair if you want." And when Abel saw her tuck it behind her ear without flinching, something flickered in his eyes, something almost tender. Supper became an unspoken ceremony. Abel would slice bread while Clara stirred the stew, and Tommy set the table with lopsided care. And though they never called it family, it began to feel that way in the quiet, in the glances exchanged across the table, in the way Abel now asked, "Did you sleep all right?" Or, "Do you want a window open?" And Clara answered, "I'm fine, thank you," though the thanks carried more meaning than the words alone. One evening, a storm rolled through, sudden and sharp, and when thunder cracked too close, Tommy woke crying, his small body shaking with old fears, and Clara lifted him from his bed and brought him to the chair by the stove, where she wrapped him in a blanket and held him close, humming a lullaby she only half remembered, and Abel stood watching from the doorway, his hands useless at his sides, until finally he crossed the room and crouched beside the chair, placing one hand on Tommy's back and the other over Clara's, just for a moment, but long enough for the boy to settle and for Clara to lean into him slightly, as if her weight belonged there, outside. The wind shook the shutters and rain beat against the roof, but inside, the room was warm, and when Tommy drifted off, Abel whispered, "He ain't afraid when you're near," and Clara said, "Maybe none of us have to be any more." And in the silence that followed, there was no need for more words. The next morning, Abel left a wooden box on the kitchen table, small but carefully made, its lid carved with 3 delicate figures, one tall, one small, and one with a braid like Clara's. And when she opened it, inside was a spool of new thread, a folded length of lace, and a tiny carved horse that Tommy had made from scrap pine. She said nothing at first, only ran her hand over the lid, as if memorizing shapes, then looked at Abel and said softly, "Thank you," and he replied, "It ain't much, but it's ours," and that was a moment she knew she'd stop being a visitor in this house. Even if the law came, even if the aunt returned with paper and warning, even if the town kept its distance and whispered behind doors, this was where her hands knew what to do, where her heart no longer reached backward, where love had not been spoken but had begun to root itself in acts, in labor, in presence, in care, and there was no letter in the world that could unmake that. It happened on a Thursday, just as the sun began to slip behind the cottonwoods and the sky turned the color of copper and ash, when Abel, with his sleeves rolled and hands still smelling of cedar, said the words that undid everything Clara had begun to believe in. "You're only needed here for Tommy," he said it plain, without anger but without warmth, and though she stood only a few feet away, it felt like being cast back to the bench at the station, alone again under a different sky. She had just placed a jar of plum preserves on the shelf, something she had boiled and sealed herself that morning, and she froze with her hand still on the lid as his words settled into the silence like dust that would never lift. She turned to face him slowly, her mouth open, then shut again, because what could she say to a man who could look at everything she had done, every fire soothed, every meal made, every hand held through storm and night terror, and see only duty? "I see," she said at last, and he didn't correct her, didn't reach for her, didn't even look away, and that hurt worst of all. She walked past him, her steps careful, and went to the room where her small suitcase waited on the bed, not because she had planned to leave, but because she had never dared unpack fully, and now she knelt beside it, folding her dresses slowly, her hands trembling but precise. Outside, the wind picked up, and the house creaked as if protesting, and Clara placed a carved wooden horse Tommy had given her back on the shelf by the bed. not out of cruelty, but because she couldn't bear to carry something that would splinter her again later. She didn't cry. Not then. Not until she heard the screen door slap shut and Tommy's small voice rise in alarm, then disappear. And suddenly Abel was shouting his name, and Clara was running, the suitcase forgotten, her boots striking the porch hard as she followed Abel across the yard toward the trees. They found Tommy, curled inside the old shed near the fence line, hugging his knees and rocking, the toy box beside him open and its contents spilled like forgotten treasures. And when he saw them, his eyes were red and wet and wild. "If she leaves, I'll go too," he said, voice shaking, and Abel dropped his knees, reaching for him. But Tommy pulled back and pointed at Clara. "She's my mama now, even if you don't say it." And Clara covered her mouth with one hand, her heart breaking at the force of his truth, while Abel looked down at the earth between them as if trying to find an answer buried there. But it wasn't in the dirt. It was in the boy's tears, and in the silence that followed, something inside Abel cracked open at last. The shed was still and cold. The smell of old hay and dust thick in the air as Abel sat beside Tommy, his hands resting uselessly on his knees, while Clara stood at the doorway afraid to step forward or retreat, caught between leaving and being left. Abel's voice, when it came, was low and uneven, like a man trying to speak through years of silence. "After Margaret died, I thought if I kept busy enough, I wouldn't feel it. If I just worked, I'd be enough." He paused, swallowed hard, then turned to Tommy. "But I see now that working and loving ain't the same thing, and I failed you, son, not because I didn't care, but because I didn't know how to show anymore." Tommy looked up, his face streaked with dirt and tears, and Clara stepped in the shed, then, slowly, as if crossing into something sacred, and when Abel looked at her, really looked, his voice broke completely. "I'm sorry for what I said. I was scared. Clara, scared of how much you've come to mean." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something wrapped in linen, unfolding it with shaking fingers to reveal a small plaque carved from walnut, its edges worn smooth, the surface engraved with 3 names in careful letters: Abel, Clara, Tommy. He held out to her like a question, not a promise, and Clara took it gently, her eyes shining but steady, and for a long time no one spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because nothing else was needed. Tommy crawled into Clara's lap, and she wrapped her arms around him as Abel placed a hand over them both, not just to comfort, but to claim them, to finally choose what had already become true. Eunice Brewer arrived 2 days later, her boots too clean for Kansas dirt and her coat too stiff for real weather, stepping down from the carriage with the kind of certainty that belongs to people who never had to wonder where they belonged. The sheriff came with her, his badge catching the sun like a warning, and though he tipped his hat politely, his presence was not a courtesy but a signal. This was official, this was final, this was law. Clara stood on the porch with Tommy pressed close against her side, one hand on his shoulder, the other gripping the plaque Abel had carved like it could hold the ground beneath them in place, and Abel stepped forward slowly, his shoulders squared not with pride but with quiet resolve, the kind forged in nights of doubt and fire-like confessions. Eunice barely looked at Clara, her gaze fixed instead on the boy, sharp and assessing, as it tried to measure the truth of him against the memory of a sister long gone. "This isn't a fit place for a child," she said, glancing at the scorched barn, the dirt-streaked fence, the worn porch steps, and Clara felt her, spine straightened at the insult not just to the home but to the life they had built inside it. The sheriff cleared his throat and said, "Miss Brewer's file for custody claims the boy needs proper family." Abel didn't raise his voice, didn't clench his fists, only stepped closer and said, "His family." He reached for Clara's hand and folded it into his own, then looked down at Tommy, who nodded once, firm and unafraid. "We're not polished," Abel said, "but we are whole and he's safe here." Eunice scoffed, pulling a paper from her coat, but before she could hand it over, a voice called from the road, and heads turned as townsfolk began to appear. First the blacksmith and his wife, then the schoolteacher, then the man from the feed store, and slowly more gathered, each one a quiet witness, each face wearing the same expression, defiance rooted in decency. The sheriff frowned, shifting his weight, and Eunice's hand wavered on the custody order as the blacksmith stepped forward and said, "I saw that woman pull Tommy from the fire," the schoolteacher added. "I've watched her walk into town every Sunday, rain or shine." And another voice chimed in, "That house was broken when she arrived, and now there's life in it." The sheriff looked at Eunice, then at Abel and Clara, then at the child who stood between them, not as a prize to be claimed, but as the anchor that had drawn them all to this moment. He sighed and tipped his hat again, this time with meaning, and said, "Court can take months, ma'am, and meantime, I won't be pulling no boy from a home like this." Eunice stood frozen, her paper now limp in her hand, her eyes scanning the crowd that no longer supported her, and though she opened her mouth to protest, no sound came, and slowly, stiffly, she turned and climbed back into her carriage without a word. As the wheels rolled away, Tommy let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding, and Abel wrapped an arm around him, while Clara leaned into his side, and the crowd, satisfied, began to drift away, but not without a few nods and warm glances, for they had seen something rare, a family chosen not by blood but by courage. Winter came slowly to Sand Hills that year, as if the prairie itself had agreed to grant a little more time to those who had nearly lost everything, and in that long breath between seasons, the Carter house began to bloom in quiet ways, not with wild color or noise, but with warmth that filled the spaces where loneliness used to live. Each morning, Clara rose before the light and lit the stove, her hands steady now, her motions familiar, and when Abel entered the kitchen with boots already dusted from feeding the animals, he would stop and kiss her temple before sitting beside Tommy, who was always waiting with 2 cups, one for him, one for Abel, and sometimes 3 if Clara hadn't yet poured her own. The house no longer echoed with absence, but with small sounds that meant something. The creak of the drying line by the fire, the rhythm of Clara's broom across the floor, the sound of Tommy laughing as he traced shapes in the fog glass of the window, and in the evenings, Abel would pull a stool to the center of the room and carve while Tommy told stories so wild and bright they made Clara smile even as she stitched buttons or mended torn knees. On one such evening, as the wind whispered against the eaves and the fire glowed low, Tommy brought a drawing to the table, done in pencil and careful lines, a house with fence, smoke curling from the chimney, and 3 small figures standing hand in hand. Beneath it, in letters A, little crooked but proud, he had written, "This is my family." And when he showed it to Clara, her breath caught, not from surprise, but from the sheer quiet truth of it, and Abel, looking over her shoulder, said nothing but place a hand on Tommy's head with such gentleness it made her eyes sting. That drawing went on the wall, pinned above the fireplace where the light would catch it, and it stayed there like a flag no wind could tear down. Days passed and routines deepened. Clara began teaching Tommy letters in the late afternoons, her voice low and patient as he stumbled over vowels, while Abel built shelves of books she was gathering from the town's little church bin, and though no one said aloud, the house was no longer Abel's or Clara's. It belonged to them all, each nail and board slowly transformed by use and memory. In the barn, Tommy built forts from leftover wood, and sometimes Clara joined him, crawling through makeshift doorways just to hear him laugh, while Abel stood in the loft above, watching them with something like awe, as if he couldn't quite believe this life had grown from ash and silence. And yet it had. The proof was in the footprints worn into the path between the porch and the well, in the apron Clara always left hanging by the back door, and the extra plate now always set at supper, whether there were guests or not, just in case, because that was how she lived now, with space for more, for whatever the future might bring. Even the neighbors, once curious and cautious, began to stop by more often. A pie here, a tool returned there, and slowly the Carter house was no longer whispered about but spoken with respect, as the place where a man had turned toward light again, and a woman had not waited to be invited to heal, and a child had dared to ask what he needed and been answered. One morning, Tommy ran in from the barn with sawdust in his hair and shouted that the kittens had finally opened their eyes, and Clara, drying her hands on her skirt, followed him outside, Abel close behind, and they knelt together in the straw to see the tiny creatures blinking up at them as if the world itself were brand new, and Clara reached out to touch one and whispered, "Look at that, they're not even scared," and Abel smiled, saying, "Why would they be? They're home," and she looked at him then, really looked, and for the first time since stepping off the train, she knew there was no train she would ever board again, not to leave, not to search, not to return to anything else, because she was exactly where she was meant to be. Later, as the sun dipped behind the trees and Tommy drew at the table and Abel fixed a leg of a chair and Clara washed dishes with her sleeves rolled to the elbows, the scent of stew in the air and the sound of wind, soft against the window, it struck her how quiet happiness could be, how it didn't shout or parade, but settled in beside you and stayed, sturdy and sure as the walls around them. And that was how it ended. Not with a kiss or a wedding or a decoration, but with a child's laughter outside, a man humming low as he worked, and a woman standing in the warmth of the kitchen she had made her own, while outside the prairie sighed beneath a sky full of stars. And somewhere on a page taped gently to the wall, 3 small figures stood hand in hand before a house that would never be empty again.
Bye-bye.